I'm going to talk about a story where there were two lives restored, actually. Life was brought to two people. And it happened in a little town called Nain. So that probably gives you the clue as to the story. Nain was a little town. It was in the area of Galilee, just 5 or so miles from Nazareth. And Nain means pleasant. And if you've been to the Galilee area, Galilee is a beautiful area. And why wouldn't you name a town a name that means pleasant in that area? And this story takes place at the entrance to the town, at the gateway, the boundary of the town. And it's a story that only Luke tells us. So I'm going to read it, the words will be on the screen. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 7 and start at verse 11. Soon afterward, he'd been in Capernaum before, and he had restored the centurion's servant. Capernaum isn't that far from Nazareth, so he was obviously just travelling in the area. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry, don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier that they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." And this news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. Well, it would, wouldn't it? It would, that kind of news. So if you picture the scene, a hot and dusty town, and the city gate, lots of people around the city gate probably, and Jesus is with a huge crowd, and he was approaching the town. I imagine he was leading the crowd would have been following him, gathering kind of around him, trying to keep up with what he was saying, trying to hear. And as they reach the town gate, they meet another large crowd on their way out. His crowd is probably noisy and chatter and, that kind of buzz of people. The other crowd that they meet is also noisy, but it's a different noise. It's the noise of weeping and wailing, the noise of grief. And at the head of that crowd is a woman. As I was reading about this, I read that the rabbis at that time, decreed, it's a terrible thing this, I think, the rabbis decreed that the woman, Eve, basically, who brought death into the world, should lead the funeral procession. It was a position of shame and humiliation, as if grief isn't enough. So the mother, the woman, had to lead the funeral crowd because that's what the custom of the day was. And Luke tells us that she was a widow and she's mourning her only son. Luke, I don't know if you've noticed, is the gospel who speaks most about the outcast, the lowly, the poor, women. He is the gospel of the underdog, if you like, we could put it that way. He speaks most about people who haven't got very much, who are not cared for by others. And we know, of course, at this time that widows were marginalised. They were the poor of society. And if they had no family, they were even poorer because they had no income. And unless their family could provide for them, then they were likely to be in poverty. So she's lost her husband. Now she's lost her son. And she's probably lost her future. Who's going to care for her now in her old age? As the large crowd with Jesus meets the large crowd with the woman, isn't it lovely that you get that kind of sense that Jesus and the woman meet, both with crowds, but Jesus and the woman meet? I find it really interesting that Luke, who is the physician, tells us nothing about the boy who's died. He just says he's died. You'd have thought the doctor would have given us at least a detail, wouldn't you? But he doesn't. Doesn't matter, I guess. He's dead. That's it. And we know from verse 12, the only son of his mother. The only son, literally her only begotten son. That's a familiar phrase, isn't it? It's written of Jesus. It literally means the only one of its kind. So her son was the only one. The only one. And verse 13 tells us that Jesus' heart went out to her. He was moved with compassion. And I'm going to come back to that because that is a lot deeper than those words suggest. I'll come back to it. And he says, don't weep, don't cry. I find that quite amusing, really. Here is this woman in the deepest of grief. And Jesus says, don't cry. It's the kind of thing that we say when we're struggling to find words, isn't it? But I don't think that's why Jesus said it, interestingly, because he knew what he was going to do. He knew what he was going to do. I wonder if it was because he wanted to get her attention. He wanted her to look at him. And Jesus went closer. And we don't know whether it was a young man. We don't know how old her son was. A young man, perhaps a young teenager. We don't know. The translation of the word that we get is not clear whether it's a boy or a young man. But he was on this bier, this stretcher, old-fashioned word bier, isn't it? B-I-E-R. And that was being carried on the shoulders of men, as was the tradition. And so it was at shoulder height. So good view for everybody in the crowd, because it's up here. And he goes up to it, and he touches it. Can you imagine the ripple of shock that goes through the crowd? Because he has done the unthinkable. Jesus, holy man of God, has touched the unclean. He's touched the dead man's stretcher. Unclean. That, of course, does not bother Jesus one bit. He is not made unclean by the unclean. And we know that because he touched the woman, didn't he? He touched the leper. Or she touched him, rather. But he touched lepers. He touches people whether they are clean or not. And when he touched, he took hold of. That's what it actually means. He took hold of. It was a firm grip, a firm grasp. And it literally means kindled. Kindled. A spark. Is that when life returned to this boy, I wonder? The kindling of life restored. But Jesus isn't finished. He says, young man, get up, raise up. He's up here, this boy. No health and safety. No health and safety. It was akin to him saying, wake up, gather yourself together. Wake up, gather yourself together. Come back. That's what he was saying to this boy. Same word later used of Jesus at his resurrection. That was the restoration of life. And the man sits up. The young man sits up. He's still up here by the sounds of it. Can you imagine what the crowd are thinking as this boy sits up on this stretcher? And he starts to chatter. Almost as though his death was just an interval, and he's carrying on his conversation. He starts to chatter. And the verse goes on and it says, Jesus gave him back to his mother. He restored him to his mother. And as I was thinking about that, I don't know whether that actually is the metaphorical kind of, lady, here is your son. You can take him home. Or did he lift him off the stretcher and put him back in her arms? Could be either. I don't know. I think it's the kind of thing Jesus would do. But he gave him back to her. Let's just think about the woman for a moment. The woman. For her, the loss of her son was a complete personal tragedy. Complete personal tragedy. It was an economic catastrophe. I alluded to that at the beginning. You could say she died because her son had died, because her life was going to be, well, empty, poor, nothing left, loss of income, loss of security, maybe the loss of her home, probably the loss of her identity, loss of purpose, loss of a future, loss of hope, all gone. That's a complete place of desolation, isn't it? But Jesus saw her and had compassion on her. It's interesting, isn't it, that she was what awoke the compassion in him, not the dead boy, she. When Jesus saw her, his heart went out to her. And that's an expression that comes from the word that is compassionate. But it's not a kind of a gentle compassion. It's not a gentle pity. This is a fierce word. This is a forceful word. This is a word that comes from the guts. Literally, guts. And if you look at the origin of the Greek word that's used here, it actually comes from the entrails, as in spleen, and literally guts. At the time, that's where the seat of emotions was thought to be. The emotions came from the gut. We still talk about gut feelings, don't we? The word that is used here is the deepest, most forceful level of emotion that could be described. And it literally compelled Jesus to act. It's hard to kind of think how that could be, isn't it? But it literally compelled him to respond to her. He could have done nothing else in that moment. I wonder, you all sitting here, I wonder if you can equate with something in that widow. Has something died for you? Or is in danger of being lost for for you, hopes and dreams, future, security, purpose. Retirement brings the challenges, doesn't it? Who are we? Empty nests. Things change in life for us all, don't they? Illness, maybe. Even faith. Even faith. Does that need restoring? Does that need bringing back to life? And Jesus meets us with that same gut level compassion that he meets the widow. And he knows our names. The widow isn't named, but he knows your name. She didn't seek him out, but Jesus met her. And he met her in the darkest place. And he can meet you, us too. Wherever that place is for you, whatever your deepest worry is, whatever your deepest anxiety is, he can meet you. What needs restoring for you today? Because the Lord of compassion wants to restore you. 2 lives were restored this day. Not just the son, but his mother as well.